Thank you, Ken. And I think actually that those remarks are remarkably relevant to the choice that you're going to make within the next half hour. This is about, trying to recommend an electoral system that fits the values of this country, and your judgment about what those values are, your judgment about the trade-offs, the sort of trade-offs that Ken talked about between proportionality, localism, some of the other things. So it's very relevant and very wise comments, I think. We have now, David, could you come back up here? I'm going to move on directly because we might have a couple of minutes later on in which, if people have a chance to ask Ken questions. But before that, we have the questions that you have asked. And I don't know whether they haven't been distributed, have they? No, okay. Well, then we just have to go through them and say to you what they were and provide the answers. So the first question is, under the MMP system, is a recount A, more or less likely, and B, more or less difficult / time consuming? David, are you going to attempt that?
I'll start and I'll let Michael Gallagher dive in at some point. Those of us who had the pleasure of trying to pick Ireland's favourite radio station on Friday night will have seen how the counting happens using MMP. So it does take a certain amount of time in terms of getting things up on a screen and everything, but a lot of it is done by computer. A lot of it is done very, very quickly. So a count in an MMP system actually would be faster than a single transferable vote, certainly the version of single transferable vote that we do here, because we do everything by paper. So I'd say a recount more or less likely, probably about the same, because you're going to get close results, so there'll be sort of a desire to go back and just check for sure we got everything right. That would be my best guess. And whether it's more difficult or time consuming, I would suggest it's an extremely complex system to understand, it's extremely complex to design, but in its operation, it would be faster to count, I would suggest.
Okay, that seems like a pretty... Michael, do you want to add?
Yes, under MMP we've got the two components. In the classic German type system, you could get a close call in an individual constituency. To recount that wouldn't take too long, and you could in theory get a close call nationally that the last seat to be decided was close, in which case I guess the whole votes across the country would have to be recounted, but really recounts under any system are pretty rare, so I think that should be a fairly minor consideration when we evaluate the rival choices.
Okay. Next question, interesting question, slightly reflects something that Francis raised yesterday. Any evidence that so-called philosopher kings, that was a phrase David used, led to better economic decisions in Europe in the last 10 years? David.
Let me just preface my remarks by saying I was being highly sarcastic when I used the phrase philosopher kings. Highly sarcastic. Francis did ask a question along those lines, and Michael or Ken could have a better answer than me, but my understanding is that overall, countries that use proportional representation of any kind overall tends to have a better sort of economic outturn overall. But that includes, in the feast, that would include our country, and so I'm not really sure if there's any systematic evidence or how one would even gather it, to be honest, on whether MMP is better than STV in that regard.
I mean, I was struck, Ken, in the last few years talking to certain Canadians and Canadian policymakers that Canada escaped if you like, the worst excesses of enthusiasm, economic enthusiasm during the first half of the decade by being a bit more prudent. Now, whether that was just good judgment on the part of people as opposed to the structure of how they're governed, that was a question.
Well, the Canadian government got its finances in order in the late 90s when it did some fairly massive budget balancing exercises, which involved reducing spending and increasing taxes to try and get them in order, so that actually when the big crisis hit, the country was probably in better shape than most. But the Canadian success, and I suppose we've come through this whole period better than anyone, is that we just had a much better regulated banking system. We had perhaps a more conservative banking system, but we had clear, a good regulation of our banks, and so we didn't get into the kind of financial crisis, as largely has been a financial crisis, that most other people did.
Yeah, I suspect that is the core of it. Michael, comment?
Well, no, just to reiterate David's point that the term philosopher kings was used in a sarcastic sense, that there's no country that has philosopher kings in Parliament. I'm sure many politicians in the room might have met their counterparts from other countries and met them with the spirit that we as TDs do all this constituency work, but in other countries they think only about national issues, and when you meet them face to face you discover actually politicians everywhere are in very close touch with their roots, and the way in which TDs in this country behave is not unusual. There are no philosopher kings, and the quality of economic decision making really depends on a lot more than what the average TD or MP is doing with their time. It might depend on things like the advice coming from the civil service or whatever it might be, but if we want philosopher kings, and we probably don't, that's not the route to success.
Okay. Next question is, why does mixed system list have to be first past the post as opposed to what we have here? Well, David, that's a relatively straightforward question, I think.
Yeah, because we've already shown on the ballot paper that you're about to vote on that it doesn't. I mean, just to say that the mixed member systems that operate around the world generally always tend to have single seat constituencies, and almost all of them have first past the post. There's one or two exceptions, slight exceptions to it. So it's just if you decide in your vote that you're going to go for a version of MMP with multi-seat single transferable vote, then this will be your world's first.
Okay, I think that's the answer to that. Why do lists end up benefiting smaller parties?
So why do lists end up benefiting smaller parties?
Yeah.
It's because the way MMP works is that generally is that the single seat constituencies are very, very hard to win if you're a small party. Very, very hard. Look at Britain. So the big parties pick up the seats. They pick up all the constituency seats. And if you remember, the logic of mixed member proportional is that the top-up, the list top-up is designed to balance out the unfairness of the constituency election. So the balancing out occurs in the way that the smaller parties are awarded most of the seats. So small parties will pick up seats in much greater proportions in a mixed member proportional system. Although, as I was saying earlier on, small parties would also pick up more seats if we just simply increased our constituency size to 5.
Okay, the next question is the first past the post combined, well, it's a sort of a statement stroke question. I take it, is the first past the post combined with the list system less democratic than what we have? Michael, would you try that?
Well, obviously, whether it's less democratic is a matter of subjective choice. What it would be, the classic German type system, excuse me, would mean that voters would not have the same power to choose among candidates from within the same party. And in some ways, that goes to the heart of the debate you saw yesterday that Brendan Halligan said it's basically a bad thing that voters can choose among candidates within the same party. That creates this kind of race to the bottom in terms of constituency work, whereas Noel Whelan was saying it's basically a good thing that voters can do that. Prevents the party organisation having too much power. It enables the voters to decide which party candidates should get the seats. So certainly an MMP system of the sort that's used in practice around the world in Germany, New Zealand, Scotland, Wales, takes that power away from voters, and the argument for doing that is that frees up politicians to do better things with their time than focus on constituency work. And the argument against it, which I guess lies behind the way the question is phrased, is that it takes power away from the voters, and that might be a bad thing. It means there's less direct accountability of TDs to voters. So that's something to consider rather than something that there is a definitive answer to.
Ken, would you like to comment? Because this is relevant to what you've said as well.
I mean, it does seem to me that it represents a different balance of values. MMP is trying to, as it works, privilege proportional representation, because ultimately it's designed to be a kind of list system combined with constituency. So it's an attempt to combine proportionality in its strictest form with a curious kind of single member accountability, local representation. So the extremes of proportionality and local representation combined, minimizing the amount of voter choice. The single transferable vote is a system which probably more than any, maximizes the kind of voter choice, but there are some costs in proportionality terms. So
Yeah.
it's a different kind of trade-off
Yeah.
between those fundamental underlying values. And so it's in some sense how do you want to balance those things, which are most important, leads you to one or the other kind of system, I think.
That's essentially at the heart of what you are going to decide in the next few minutes. And this last question, or the second last question here, which I think was touched upon by John earlier, in the MMP system, how can it be configured to provide security, in brackets survival, for the successful candidate in the next election? David, I think you to some extent answered that earlier.
I think so. It was basically John's question. Maybe this was your question in the box. I don't know. Okay, it was. Yeah. So the glib answer, but there's some truth in that answer, is the candidate needs to make sure that they keep in favour with the party leadership. But there is the other thing which came up yesterday, the question of dual candidates. So a candidate, somebody who's elected with mixed member proportional, might be also a constituency candidate next time round, so they could come back that way if they needed to.
Okay.
But the great thing about elections is nobody's seat is guaranteed.
No.
If it was, we wouldn't need to have another election.
The very last question here, I'm not quite sure I understand it. It says, do reps from smaller parties end up in YN? I'm not sure what does that mean.
Is that a tweet thing or something? I don't know.
No, I don't know.
What's YN?
Yes or no? I presume, yeah, but I don't understand what the question is. So, unless the person who asked it could identify or clarify what it is they...
What was the question again?
Do reps from smaller parties end up in YN? This is... End up in what?
Oh.
Oh, I see what... Yeah, I'm afraid I still don't understand it.
The question is, I guess, to candidates from small parties, do they manage to get elected?
Under MMP? That's the question.
Do they manage... Yeah.
Do representatives of smaller parties get elected? In MMP, yes. So if the question is, do small parties win seats? In MMP, they win list seats. But I'll say it again, in single transferable vote with 5-seat constituencies, the same answer would apply.
Okay, is there a comment here from John? Yeah, okay.
I'd like to put a question to Professor Carthy. Professor Carthy, you said the regulators in Canada did a very good job in the financial regulator. That has to be politically led, as well as having good staff working in the regulations departments. Here in Ireland, the politicians of all parties and all regulators let the people down badly. What was the main difference between the structures in Canada and Ireland, and is it down to personalities or the whole structure of Canada?
Well, I mean, the superficial answer would be that, you know, Canada is a country run by Scots Presbyterians, and that there's a long tradition of fairly conservative banking and bank regulations. I mean, we live next door to Americans who for many years didn't believe in national banks, and with national banks weren't allowed to exist. And so there's kind of this long proliferation of thousands of banks that there is across the United States. Well, there's only 5 or 6 big national banks in Canada. They've been long time regulated by the government, by the Bank of Canada. They are, by their nature, relatively conservative beasts in terms of the wider world. They were operating in a strong resource economy, so I think that there was a kind of constellation of factors. I don't know if there's any kind of moral virtue in Canadians. I think that there was just a kind of historical tradition of conservative, cautious banking and bank regulation that we had in place. And we happened to have a government in the 1990s that decided that they had to get their books in order because we did face some serious fiscal challenges, so we were in good shape.
So Scots Presbyterianism and getting the economic cycle, being out of sync with the
Well, I mean,
economic cycle for
I
the rest
wouldn't
of the
offer
world.
that as a general law of public life, but.
But I mean, you're talking about, again, deeply held, and it does go back to electoral systems as well. You know, you have a tradition in Canada, which is not surprising you're prudent, and yeah, that's it.
Well, we probably are the least adventurous country in the world in terms of election law and election change.
Yeah.
You know, we don't do anything very dramatic or change systems. I mean, the Australians are the great experimenters. They're prepared to try anything and experiment and are very vigorous. We're very slow and cautious. And, you know, it's said that Canada is a Catholic country run by Scots Presbyterians and Australia is a kind of Protestant country run by Irish Catholics. And there may be something in that difference.
Okay. Okay, I mean, we've reached actually coffee time. I don't know where, are the ballots ready, David, do you know?
I believe that as we're talking, they're being translated and
They're
printed.
being translated at the moment. So I think we'll break now for coffee. The ballots will be distributed in the next few minutes. And could you please, and you'll obviously want to take time on this, but you do have half an hour to both complete your ballot and have coffee. But we will resume at 12:15. Thank you.